Islamophobia is on the rise. According to campaigners, Muslim communities across Europe are facing a backlash of verbal abuse as a result of the recent terrorist attacks in Paris. And that's not all. There's also been an increase in hate crimes involving violence against Muslims right across Europe. In fact, in January 2015 alone, concerned Charities registered literally hundreds of attacks against Muslims. Analysts have blamed the mainstream Western media for some of this rise. They accuse the broadcasters of grossly disproportionate representation of terrorism as a primarily Muslim issue, and virtually ignore the peace-loving nature of the Muslim faith itself, and the vast majority of Muslims who practice their religion peacefully. But the media is undeterred, and many blame Western governments for indirectly feeding the hatred, thus oppressing Muslim thought and expression. Muslims and indeed non-Muslim observers claim a persecution against the faith, but the West continues to treat Muslims as the problem. So why doesn't the mainstream European media represent the realities of terrorism? How influential is the media in influencing perceptions of Muslims across Europe? And is Islamophobia born out of understanding or ignorance? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began with an example. Across Europe, there is generally tolerance towards religious clothing, except when it comes to young women who wish to study in hijabs at school or at university. What should be done about that form of religious discrimination? We put that question to the public.
I believe that people have the right to express themselves in any way they feel fit, as long as it's not threatening to individuals or other people. So in my view, I think people should be able to allow to wear whatever they believe is either for a religious purpose or to express themselves, be it they want to wear school uniform, for example, and wear trousers and not a skirt, etc. So no, I don't think that's right.
Hijab is part of a culture, it's part of a religion. It's like you, for example, you telling English people or Christian people or people that believe in Jesus or you can't celebrate Christmas. You can't celebrate Easter.
At the end of the day, I wear a turban. I'm a Sikh, I'm not a Muslim. It's part of your identity. So therefore, I think that it's wrong, perhaps, for somebody to dictate to somebody else whether they can do something or not, if it's part of their religious duties.
I think that's wrong. I'm actually a teacher in an international school, and we've got a range of different students in terms of background and faith. And I think it's part of their cultural identity. I'm also a law graduate, so I can see why there are arguments in terms of identity issues, or more so giving evidence in court, but I don't really see how it would be an issue in school unless there's some form of segregation, but that would be something completely different.
In fact, Europe provides absolute freedom of religious clothing to around 10 religious groups. And yet, young Muslim women are prevented from wearing their hijab when studying at school or university. We asked our experts what they believe should be done about that form of religious discrimination.
Well, the first thing to say is that's not the case Europe-wide. I mean, certain European countries ban religious clothing and ban the hijab, but this country doesn't. I mean, France does. I think that Belgium does. So it's not completely the same across all European countries. I mean, we're all part of the European Union, but there are different regulations and laws in different countries. Well, in my view, those countries that do ban the hijab, which is a few European countries like France, should also ban the wearing of other forms of religious clothing as well. It seems to me you can't have one law for one set of religious practitioners and no law for the others. So if they want to ban people wearing the hijab, they should also ban other people, from Jews, Christians, and the lot.
The situation in Europe right now is very contradictory and very confusing. So on the one hand, some countries allow all sorts of dress, including women wearing hijab, and other countries are cracking down on this. They're actually enacting laws and policies to deny it. And what happens from a legal point of view is that a case has to be brought by an individual, not even an organisation, who has been discriminated against, to the national courts, and then eventually, if it fails, to the European courts. Now, what we've seen happening is, in fact, the European courts, despite the European Convention on Human Rights which it is supposed to be making its decisions on, has been actually turning against Muslim rights generally, and particularly about Muslim women's dress in particular over the last 10 years or so. So we're in a situation now where, unfortunately, the law is not really providing an avenue for Muslim women to get their rights, even though, if you read the law, the spirit of the law and the word of the law, it should actually support it. We have judges and lawyers who are effectively saying they're going to interpret it in completely the opposite way. And it leaves Muslim women in a very difficult position. What can you do if the law is not respecting you, supporting you, and defending you? This is a question we have to find an answer to.
Soldiers from so-called Christian countries have killed millions of innocent civilians across the last 15 years, over which time so-called Muslim extremists have killed thousands. Why doesn't the mainstream Western media reflect those statistics? We asked the public.
I don't know. Maybe because they think that what they're doing is right and what they're doing is wrong, but we don't know what the whole cause is for, why they're killing each other, really and truly. So they say that they're terrorists, but if a Christian did the same thing, they wouldn't be classed as a terrorist, they'd just be classed as extremists, so I don't know.
I think it sells newspapers, if I'm honest. I think there's so much, for example, if you look at things that's happened in Ireland and other countries that aren't portrayed in the press at the moment, and there seems to be some sort of paranoia or need to fulfil some justification for what's going on. So I believe it's there to fulfil what they believe is the paranoia of an individual and what people want to hear. I don't think it necessarily portrays, and certainly doesn't if you look at the figures, portray reality.
To be honest, I think there's a lot of different treatment because these countries that we are condemning don't serve our interests. Saudi Arabia has had some terrible things going on there, and we recently celebrated the life of one of their deceased kings, and he had a questionable record, but Saudi Arabia acts as some form of ally, and they've got terrible human rights abuses. So really, I think it's kind of who you pick on. North Korea are picked on, but if they had a lot more raw materials and use to us, then I think that it would be a different picture. I think it's quite a slanted picture that we're getting through the press.
We asked our experts why the mainstream media is allowed to reflect a clear anti-Muslim bias in its treatment of terrorism.
Let's put it this way. I mean, the media don't represent all killings equally. There's no question about that. If you look at what happens in just the UK alone, attacks on Muslims are much less reported than the occasional attacks by Muslims. There's no question about that. If you look at what is happening in the Middle East, yes, I think that killings by Muslim forces on the whole are given more attention than killings by British forces. I think there's little doubt about that. But that's because the media over here tend to take sides. They're going to side with what the Sun would call our boys, and they're going to regard as terrorists those people who are fighting them. So if one is asking, is the kind of equality of arms here? Are British soldiers who kill Muslims abroad represented in the same way as Muslims who kill British soldiers abroad? No, they're not.
I think we have to be careful in labelling it Christian, not because it doesn't have Christian elements in it, but because when those countries are doing, in fact, quite terrible things, including killing people in their hundreds of thousands around the world in many wars, you somehow indirectly or directly demonize all Christians or claim this is done in the name of Christianity. This is exactly what's being kind of used to demonize Muslims, and we need to move away from that rhetoric. I am a decolonial scholar. I often talk about what's been done in the name of Christendom in the history of colonialism. That's to make it distinct from both Christianity and from Christians themselves. We have to be careful about this. If we're talking about the kind of injustices that are happening, and we look at what European and American and westernized states are doing, we do have to acknowledge that they are using overwhelming power to enact extreme violence. And compared to that, the acts of a few Muslims who are misrepresenting Islam, there isn't really a comparison. And unfortunately, the media doesn't portray that. The media is complicit with power. It is part of the power structure, and it makes that structure invisible, so that mass violence is invisible. And then the random acts of violence, however appalling they may be, are the ones that get all the attention. and therefore give the impression to ordinary people that this is in fact extreme violence, when in fact this is often a response to truly extreme violence.
Which ethnic or religious group in the UK, or indeed across Europe, is most likely to be demonised by the media, is the public's view?
Obviously Muslims, definitely. But there's many other people out there, many different religions that do a lot of things, but they don't class it as a terrorist act because of their religion. So I think, yeah, mainly Muslims, yeah.
Probably Islam, unfortunately. It's a religion that I think everybody should respect. And in reverse as well, they should respect other religions. So unfortunately, when I'm reading the paper, and I don't do that too often, it is usually to do with that religion, and it's sad, really.
Media gives a bad view on Islam, and I think sometimes media tend to joke about Christianity too much. Yeah. So, but I would say it's giving a bad view on Islam, sadly.
Of course, the Muslims, definitely. Definitely the Muslims, certainly, yeah. And with good reason. I mean, they could do much better than this. In their schools, in their mosques, and so on and so forth. Being a Muslim, I'm saying that they can do much better, and they ought to do much better.
I would probably say Muslims, although actually Christianity has its fair amount of bad press at the moment as well.
Is there data to indicate which ethnic or religious group gets the most negative press? We sought an expert opinion.
I think again it's very difficult to talk in terms of Europe. I think one has to talk in terms of different European countries. I mean, I think that there's no doubt about it that Muslims are demonised across a wide range of European countries, but I would also argue that people like travellers and certainly the Roma, gypsies, are certainly demonised. They're demonised in the UK, they're highly demonised in countries like Hungary and Slovakia, to some extent even in Ireland as well. So, you know, I think there's a tendency in the mainstream media today to demonise virtually anybody who is seen as other and who is seen as different.
I think there is a case to be made that increasingly Muslims are the target, or the biggest target, of racism in European and westernised settings. You have to include North America, Australia in these settings. However, there are other communities who are suffering quite severely, who may not be so well known. One of those is the Roma community. And also we have to think very carefully about the rise of other forms of racism as a result of the rise in Islamophobia. For a long time, racism had started to become taboo in Europeanized settings. So anti-black racism was something that you could no longer express. Anti-Semitism was something you could no longer express. And what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, and surprisingly in the United Kingdom, which had a better record on this than probably most of Europe, is that these other racisms have now become more public again, and you will hear people talking in quite openly anti-black racist terms or anti-Semitic terms in the media, on social media. Even now we have a march in the United Kingdom against Jewification. This was something that would have been cracked down on and made illegal a few years ago. Suddenly it's being allowed to go ahead. We're in a very dangerous time.
Recently, near London, a young female Muslim student died from 16 stab wounds to her head, neck and arms. To what extent do the public hold the media responsible for the rise in attacks against Muslims, and why?
I think the media has a lot of influence that it could use in lots of different cases. They can stir us up and they can deflate us. It makes no difference as to whether it's the Green Party, the SDP. Once they decide to hitch their colours to a bandwagon, they will run with it irrespective. You won't find them changing course midway either. So I think the media, has got a lot of responsibility, doesn't always use it that well.
It wouldn't surprise me if that has a part to do with it, actually, because I think if you read a negative things about something, it kind of strengthen your prejudice and stuff like that. So yeah, I think media has a lot of power, and they should think about how they're using it.
Well, you can say it played a part in it. It's how you report certain incidents and all that kind of stuff. Headlines, wow. And we're very good with, you know, dramatic headlines, which can make anybody go out and start doing silly things. And as I said, it's how certain things are reported. So when you do that, yes, you are going to provoke some people.
There must be a cause behind the rise in Islamophobia. We asked our experts for their analysis of the relationship between media reporting and anti-Muslim attacks.
If you look at the national press, and to some extent, well, not quite so bad, the regional press, fact and opinion are completely mixed up together, and lots of articles, both articles posing as news articles and editorials and comment pieces and pieces by pundits, are perfectly free to represent not just Muslims, I would argue, but lots of people of colour in a very, very negative way. They do. They don't say, right, go out now and kill these people or drive them from our shores, but I think there's a little doubt that cumulatively these articles in newspapers add to a climate of Islamophobia, and Islamophobia can lead, and does lead sometimes, to Muslims being attacked. I mean, you've only got to look at what happened after the murder of Lee Rigby, which people only knew about because it was reported in the media and in the press. There was a massive rise in attacks on Muslims after that, and bombings of mosques and everything, all of which, by the way, were underreported. I mean, that's the interesting thing, I think, in this country. It's not simply the way in which Muslims and people of colour are reported and represented. It's the quite extraordinary underreporting of attacks on those people. If you go on to the Institute of Race Relations website, you know, they do a weekly roundup of news, and so many of those stories are about attacks on not just Muslims, but, you know, people who are just generally seen as other. In most cases, those stories aren't reported. They are reported up to a point in local newspapers, which are better than national press, but for the most part, the national press doesn't report attacks on Muslims, anything like as much as it reports attacks by Muslims, and yet there are more attacks on Muslims than by Muslims.
The research that we've undertaken over many years, our latest findings are going to be published in March 2015 for the United Kingdom, show a connection between the media, the legal system, political discourse, and how they mutually support each other in creating a hate environment. We give the example of a hate environment created for Muslims and against Muslims. And the role that media plays in this, and when we talk about media, we don't mean individual journalists or all journalists, we mean the institution, is unfortunately a very severe one. We can't really kind of differentiate between different mainstream media when they are not really pointing out catastrophic extremes of violence, when they are really just replicating demonized discourse. And oftentimes it's done unknowingly, but at the end of the day, you know, those empowering media organizations have to take responsibility and realize there's a problem. They are complicit in the rise. It's not just about media, although generally people blame the media the most, but certainly they're not being critical to power, they're being part of power, and while that happens, they have to take some responsibility.
Do you believe that Islamophobia is born out of understanding or ignorance? That's the question we asked the public.
Yeah, maybe because people don't really understand it, but really and truly what people should think every religion should respect, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Muslim, we all, you know, believe the same thing. There is a God out there. They have their different perceptions of God. There's a different perception of Jesus, whatever you want to call it, Muhammad. But I don't know why they do it. It's just everyone should be equal.
I don't think people understand Islam, to be quite honest. My corner shop is run by Muslims, and they say, you know, please don't think of us in the same breath as people who are running around with machine guns. We're not like that. That isn't what the Quran said. That isn't what Prophet Muhammad says. You know, this is somebody else's interpretation that we've got no control over.
People are confused Me as Muslim in areas where perhaps religious education isn't taught, I today unfortunately mistaken a Vietnamese guy for a Chinese guy, which was quite disrespectful, I thought. And you know, at the end of the day, you cast a dispersion on many, many different people, but unless you actually understand who they are, then I think that you should learn a bit more about different cultures and religions.
I think that has a huge part to play. I mean, I don't claim by any means to understand every religion, let alone Islam, and I think it's driven by fear of people not understanding what's going on. Again, the press suggesting there are links to certain religions, albeit again, my view is that it's extremism, regardless of what religion you are, is something completely different. And so yeah, I think it drives a huge amount.
So is Islamophobia created by objective information or the lack of it? We gave the last word to our experts.
Well, I think most phobias of most things are bred of a lack of understanding. I mean, certainly in this country, and in every other country across Europe, by the way, the first thing that people don't understand is how many Muslims are in the country. In every single European country, and in fact even beyond Europe, people massively, but massively overestimate the number of Muslims in the country. So there's a complete factual error to start with. Then, do they understand what Islam is? No, for the most part they don't. You know, the media talk in a rather ignorant way about the Muslim community. But anybody who knows anything about Islam and Muslims know there isn't a Muslim community, there are communities. And there are many different forms of Islam and different forms of belief. The newspaper is always holding forth about what Muslims believe, but some Muslims might believe that and many others don't. So, yes, I think that fear and indeed hatred is very often born of ignorance. And I think that, you know, the British media, particularly the British press, have really helped to generate ignorance about Muslims and Islam in this country, not generate knowledge about it.
Our research and our theory, called the domination hate model of intercultural relations, argues that whilst, you know, there is a lot of ignorance about Islam, we can't blame individual people, even the individuals who commit hate attacks, for their own ignorance, because they are often relying, in fact, almost always relying on information that they get from the media, from politicians, from their educational environments, on many different issues, including and especially about minority communities, because they don't have access to them. And they don't have access because minority communities are small, they can't live everywhere. In that scenario, ordinary people are just looking to the media, to the government for information. And what we found is people who commit hate attacks, you know, they're not members of extreme groups, they're not members of right-wing groups, they're usually mainly ordinary people who just feel provoked and so angry to do something. And so in that scenario, as much as they are ignorant, they're not just kept ignorant, they are fed false information which incites them to commit, you know, sometimes extreme violent acts. Our survey shows that 16% of people in the Muslims in the United Kingdom in the last year experienced a violent attack. That's up by about 2% from 5 years before.
The Western media is keen to report terrorism, but it seems to do so through a filter, one which puts a Muslim slant on terrorist acts. Far from making the world a more peaceful place, this merely serves to stir up anti-Muslim sentiment and has led directly to the deaths of Muslims and non-Muslims alike. However, that consideration does not fit what the West wants its public to believe. And so the media bias continues, with a result which can be summarised in just one word: Islamophobia.